Hello everyone. Here we will take a look at another video from the Discovery Institute that was made by our friend Long Story Short. This one is about transitional fossils, specifically those showing the evolution of whales. So, let's jump right in. As some of you may know, LSS produced a video on homology that was first put on YouTube by the Discovery Institute. We responded to that in the video Misunderstanding Homology, which started a series of back and forth video responses. However, this is not a continuation of that discussion. Here we will tackle LSS' latest installation that is again published on the Discovery Institute's YouTube channel. Although I have to mention that someone has beaten us to the punch. PZ Myers has already made a response video, though ours will be a bit different from his, and we couldn't turn down this opportunity to respond to LSS, especially since we had already finished the script. So, without further ado, let's begin.
Darwin thought that bears could turn into whales. Back in the 1800s, when Darwin first published The Origin of Species, this is exactly what he said. And he was brutally mocked by scientists of his day for thinking something so ridiculous. He even retracted the idea from later editions of his book.
First, Darwin didn't say bears could have turned into whales. You can clearly see that in the highlighted part LSS shows. Here, Darwin speculated that distant descendants of bears could give rise to creatures that were more aquatic and be similar to whales, in the same way ichthyosaurs were similar to whales. But they wouldn't be whales, just like ichthyosaurs weren't whales. This might seem like nitpicking, but we need to consider that a lot of people think the theory of evolution says dogs could evolve into cats, or they ask questions like, could a dog evolve into a whale? That's of course not true. The law of monophily forbids such a thing from happening. Likewise, bears couldn't give rise to whales for the same reason. See our video, Do Dogs Produce Non-Dogs, for a more detailed explanation of this.
But here's the kicker. Scientists of today think essentially the same thing. Stupid Darwin thinks bears could have turned into whales. How ridiculous. Everyone knows these wolf, pig, weasel, hippo things are what turned into whales. My, how the tables have turned.
When paleontologists are describing extinct creatures to the layman, rather than using technical jargon, it's easier to describe it in analogous terms. This extinct creature was kinda like this modern one you've seen in a zoo. For example, Thylacoleo is often called the marsupial lion, even though apart from being a carnivore, it is very much not like a lion. Likewise, mesonychids, which were once considered to be the ancestral taxon of whales, are often described as sheep in wolves' clothing, since they were hooved carnivores. But aside from that, their appearance was very different from either wolves or sheep. Currently, whales are considered to be descended from artiodactyls, i.e. cloven-hooved mammals. So when paleontologists are describing extinct artiodactyl relatives of whales to the layman, they often make references to more familiar artiodactyls like pigs and hippos. But a more accurate description would be to say that these creatures have specific traits that are only found among artiodactyls, thereby making them members of that group. But they also possessed a couple of whale traits. As the 2010 review paper, The Origin of Whales, notes, quote, early whale relatives like those in the family Pachycetidae retain many apomorphic features found in terrestrial artiodactyls, including a small mandibular foramen and mandibular canal, long cervical vertebrae, long gracile limbs with a double pulleyed astragalus in the ankle, long metapodials, and four solidly fused sacral vertebrae. The cetacean features of Pachycetids include a pachyosteosclerotic bulla bearing an involucrum and sigmoid process, cheek teeth modified for shearing with reentrant grooves on the anterior margins of the molars, lower molars that lack trigonid and talonid basins, and upper molars that have a very small trigon basin, an anterior dentition composed of incisors and canines that is in line with the cheek teeth, and a long, narrow post-orbital temporal region of the skull, close quote. That's a very technical description, so no wolf, hippo, weasel, or pig did or could have evolved into whales. LSS misrepresents very loose descriptions that are intended to help people visualize the approximate appearance of these animals as if they were meant to be taken literally. Again, this may seem like nitpicking, but it's important to note how LSS uses this kind of appeal to absurdity to make it sound as though modern scientists are being hypocritical or uncritical in order to muddy the waters before he even gets into any specific argument.
So according to Coyne, whale evolution is such great evidence since we have a chronologically ordered series of fossils, and it goes something like this. The sequence begins with a raccoon-sized animal called Indohyus, living 48 million years ago. 52 million years ago, we see a wolf-sized creature called Pakicetus, which is a bit more whale-like than Indohyus. At 50 million years ago, there's the remarkable Ambulocetus. Rhodocetus, 47 million years ago, is even more aquatic. Finally, at 40 million years ago, we find the fossils of Basilosaurus and Dorodon, before we have our modern whales. Let's take a look a little bit closer at this chronologically ordered series of fossils. If you're paying attention, you might be thinking something fishy is going on here, but no, you'd be wrong. That would not be a bad pun because whales are mammals, not fish. But also, yes, something mammally was going on here. Granting the standard Darwinian dates for these fossils, Indohyus is dated as far younger than his supposed descendants, and he's not the only one, more on that later. This is common practice in evolutionary analysis, to ignore where species actually show up in the fossil record and place them wherever makes Darwinian sense, creating what are called chronological inversions, or ghost lineages. Oh, that's so spooky. The fossil record often reveals fossils out of the order that they're supposed to be in.
Fossils out of the order they are supposed to be in. This is the main mistake that LSS makes in this video, and it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how evolution works. Evolution is often perceived as a linear process. Species A leads to species B, which leads to species C, etc. And when species A evolved into species B, species A went extinct. And when C appeared, B went extinct, etc. If this is how evolution works, then yes, we would always expect to see transitional fossils in the precise chronological order. Species A should always be found before B and B before C, etc. No exceptions. However, this isn't how evolution works at all. But it is unfortunately a common misconception that makes people ask things like, if humans came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? But evolution is not a ladder. It's a complex branching process leading to a wide variety of species that in turn may diversify and continue alongside each other, perhaps for a long time. Some may go extinct at different times while others continue repeating the process. So we don't expect to see a single sequential series of species. We expect to see a wide variety of species. Most of these would have been cousins of the direct ancestors, which coexisted at different times. And since these cousins would be closely related to the direct ancestors, we also expect that both share many traits between them, including the traits that identify them all as transitional forms, including the cousins, not just the direct ancestors. This is why transitional doesn't mean ancestral. Less derived species can be found alongside or even later than more derived species, which does not contradict evolution. Another thing to consider is the imperfection of the fossil record. It's a scattershot. We don't expect to find fossils of every species to have ever lived, so of the transitional fossils that we will find, most of which will be cousins, they likely have diverged from each other for a long time without leaving any previous trace of their divergence as fossils. These are the ghost lineages that LSS was referring to, but he is wrong about what they are. They aren't created by scientists because they ignore where species actually show up in the fossil record and place them wherever it makes Darwinian sense. They are gaps in the fossil record, and there will always be gaps in the fossil record because the fossil record will always be incomplete. What matters is whether these gaps have been significantly reduced with the discovery of transitional fossils, and they have. The lineage from terrestrial mammals to fully aquatic whales used to be one big 20 million year long gap, but in the last 40 years, we filled this gap with numerous species, not just the ones that LSS mentioned. We also have fossils showing the transition from teeth to baleen in Mysticetti whales, and gaps are still being filled to this day. Last year, researchers found Paragocetus, which narrowed down when and how protocetids, a paraphyletic group of amphibious four-legged whales, migrated from South Asia to the Americas. Because transitional fossils aren't necessarily direct ancestors, and since the fossil record is incomplete, there is no strict species-to-species order they are supposed to be in. LSS is once again arguing from a false assumption. That's not to say the chronological order of fossils within the geologic timescale isn't relevant whatsoever. We should indeed expect a general pattern of chronology in the fossil record, but definitely not in the neat species-to-species order that LSS is expecting, definitely not in most cases. The chronological order in the fossil record is actually very congruent with phylogenies, especially at the larger taxonomic and time scales. For example, the chronological order of the first animals before the first chordates, before the first tetrapods, before the first reptiles, before the first mammals, etc. Even with regard to whale evolution specifically, we do find the first semi-aquatic whales before the obligate aquatic whales. We find the first whales with nostrils at the tip, before the first with nostrils in the middle of the head, before the first with the blowhole at the top. But finding primitive species that lived after some that are more derived is not at all unexpected, and it doesn't negate the overall congruence in chronology that we do observe. To reiterate, evolution predicts transitional species, which are identified primarily by their morphology. Whether the species appear in a perfect chronological order from primitive to derived, or whether there are still gaps in the fossil record is irrelevant. These are still transitional fossils that were predicted based on evolutionary theory. At no point does LSS actually address this.
For just a couple of other examples, let's take a look at bird evolution. It's supposed to go theropod dinosaurs evolving into birds, with the fossil Archaeopteryx being evidence of this as an intermediate fossil. But the problem is he appears long before the dinosaurs he was supposed to have descended from.
LSS shows a quote from Robert Martin's book, Missing Links, in the bottom left of the screen that says, quote, "Theropods all occur in the fossil record after Archaeopteryx and so cannot be directly ancestral," close quote. Theropods in brackets. I wonder what the original quote actually says. Well, I checked it out, and in the book, Martin says, quote, "The small coelurosaurian dinosaurs related to Archaeopteryx all occur in the fossil record after Archaeopteryx and so cannot be directly ancestral, although as Kevin Padian has shown, small delicate theropods existed in North America about the same time as Archaeopteryx in the Old World," close quote. That's very different from the other quote saying theropods all occur after Archaeopteryx, which is flat out false. The earliest Archaeopteryx fossils are from the late Jurassic 150 million years ago, while theropod dinosaurs can be found as far back as 80 million years earlier than this, in the Triassic. Coelurosaurs, on the other hand, are a subset of theropods. The major groups of coelurosaurs include tyrannosauroids, compsognathids, ornithomimosaurs, therizinosaurs, alvarezsaurids, oviraptorosaurs, dromaeosaurids, and troodontids. None of these are supposed to be direct ancestors of avialans, like Archaeopteryx. They are cousins, some more closely related to avialans than others, so Archaeopteryx also falls within the coelurosaur group. Although, as you can see here, the phylogenetic relationships between Archaeopteryx and other coelurosaurs predicts that there were other coelurosaurs prior to Archaeopteryx, particularly smaller coelurosaurs, for which we didn't have any fossils. This is what Robert Martin was actually referring to. Does this gap mean that Archaeopteryx is not a transitional fossil? No. As explained previously, the fact that gaps remain doesn't make transitional fossils invalid. Archaeopteryx itself filled in a gap that used to be empty. However, the quote wherein Martin mentioned this gap originated from his book that was published in 2004. Since then, we have found fossils of multiple coelurosaurs older than Archaeopteryx, confirming exactly what this phylogeny would predict based on previous data. As the 2010 paper, Pre-Archaeopteryx Coelurosaurian Dinosaurs and Their Implications for Understanding Avian Origins reads, quote, "Here we highlight one issue that is often considered to raise problems for the theropod hypothesis of avian origins, i.e. the temporal paradox in the stratigraphic distribution of theropod fossils. The idea that the earliest known avian is from the late Jurassic, but most other Coelurosaurian groups are poorly known in the Jurassic, implying that avians arose before their supposed ancestors. However, a number of Jurassic non-avian Coelurosaurian theropods have recently been discovered, thus documenting the presence of most of the major Coelurosaurian groups in the Jurassic alongside or prior to avians. These discoveries have greatly improved the congruence between stratigraphy and phylogeny for derived theropods, and effectively, they reject the temporal paradox concept. In the last decade, we have recovered well-preserved specimens of several Coelurosaurian taxa from the Jurassic sediments, including the basal tyrannosauroid Guanlong, the basal alvarezsauroid Haplochirus, the basal troodontid Anchiornis, and the Scansoriopterigids Epidendrosaurus and Epidexipteryx. These discoveries provide significant new information on various aspects of Coelurosaurian evolution, and in particular, on avian origins." Close quote. And in 2013, Eorun was described as one of the oldest coelurosaurs, being about 11 million years older than Archaeopteryx.
Evolution also got a big stick in its spokes with this guy, Tiktaalik, a fish-like creature that was for years crowned as the smoking gun transitional fossil of fish starting to go from the sea to the land. Brilliant evidence, just what they expected. Until in 2010, fossil footprints of true tetrapods were found in Poland, long before they were supposed to have evolved. And all of a sudden Tiktaalik was dethroned as a transitional fossil because, again, the dates are all out of order.
Tiktaalik wasn't dethroned as a transitional fossil. Again, transition is not the same as ancestral. Tiktaalik was never considered a direct ancestor of tetrapods even before these trackways were discovered. To quote the original paper that first described the discovery of Tiktaalik in 2006, quote, "A phylogenetic analysis of Sarcopterygian fishes and early tetrapods supports the hypothesis that Tiktaalik is the sister group of tetrapods." Close quote. A sister group is not ancestral. Because the fossil record is incomplete, the exact time of divergence between the fossil species and extant lineages are often underestimated. Fossils only set a minimum age for the appearance of a clade. There were almost certainly older species of their clade, and when we do find fossil evidence of those, scientists update their model by pushing back the minimal age of the taxon. This is exactly what the scientists did with regard to tetrapods. What the tracks showed was that tetrapods and transitional fishopods, such as Tiktaalik, diverged much earlier than previously evident, and that both early tetrapods and the intermediate species coexisted for a long time. So the only thing that was significantly changed with this finding was the minimal age of tetrapods being pushed further back from 377 million years ago, when the oldest tetrapod body fossils are found, to 390 million years ago, when the oldest tetrapod trackways are found. But the fossils of Tiktaalik and many others still show the intermediate characteristics from fish to tetrapods. They are still transitional fossils regardless.
Back to the chronologically ordered series of fossils, Basilosaurus and Dorodon are considered fully aquatic whales. They're not a transition to anything.
Not a transition to anything? So far, LSS has focused on the chronology, but doesn't even discuss the transitional morphology of these species whatsoever. He just asserts that Basilosaurus and Dorodon aren't transitional in any way. Just because they're fully aquatic, that doesn't mean they don't show any other transitional features that are primitive compared to the crown group whales that are alive today. The transitional fossils from toothed whales to baleen whales that were previously mentioned were all aquatic too, yet still very transitional. Regarding the Basilosaurids, while they are fully aquatic, they still lack some of the characteristics that all living whales share, most notably the blowhole. The nostrils of Basilosaurids were still in the middle between the tip of the snout and the top of the head. They also retain some of the ancestral traits that all living whales have lost, like external hind limbs, which were extremely reduced in Basilosaurids, but still with the very recognizable anatomy of hind legs. These are transitional features, hence they are very much transitional.
By intermediate, paleontologists usually mean a fossil is merely morphologically intermediate. In other words, if a fossil has features of a supposed ancestor and descendant, then it is classified as an intermediate or transitional fossil.
Exactly. So they are still transitional. So, thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time. Wait. He's not done yet.
But with that definition, I would be a morphological intermediate between this jockey and this professional basketball player. But that doesn't say anything about lineage, whether I'm an ancestor or descendant of either one. We could be completely unrelated, or even chronologically out of order. That wouldn't matter.
Darn it, he was so close to getting it, yet he still messed up in the end. LSS would really benefit from reading the scientific literature to see how the morphology of transitional fossils are recognized and analyzed. Morphology goes a bit deeper than just differences in size. Like, does LSS think that scientists say Ambulocetus is intermediate between Pakicetus and Dorodon just because it is larger than the former but smaller than the latter? I really hope not. A trait as simple as body size is rarely even a factor in deciding whether a species is transitional or not, precisely because it can vary between members of the same species. And it's very easy for two species to evolve a similar body size without being closely related. This is why traits like the presence or absence of bones and the specific shapes of bones are what are actually input into phylogenetic analyses. They're not the kind of thing that varies within a population. They vary between species that have quite significantly diverged to the point of being clearly distinct organisms.
The very thing they're trying to prove, the ancestral relationship, or how they came about, is pure assumption. This is how they can say there's tons of intermediate fossils and be technically correct, while at the same time skeptics can say, yeah, there aren't really any intermediate fossils, and also be correct. The fossil evidence is so meager that Darwinists, in order to prove evolutionary ancestry, they have to use a slippery definition that no one would accept in other areas of life.
Except we don't use a slippery definition. Transitional fossils are defined in terms of morphology, i.e. a transitional species is a species that exhibits a mix of plesiomorphic, or primitive, traits of a parent taxon and apomorphic, or derived, traits of a daughter taxon. It all comes down to the predictive power of the theory and properly understanding what these expectations actually entail. The theory predicts that many more cousins compared to the direct ancestors would have existed during the evolution of a particular lineage. And since the fossil record is incomplete, we would expect that the fossil species are cousins more often than they are direct ancestors. But since these cousins were close relatives of the direct ancestors, the theory also predicts that these fossils would show transitional morphologies with varying degrees of plesiomorphic and apomorphic traits. In the case with whales, the parent taxon is mammals and the daughter taxon is the crown group of modern whales. In this specific case, the prediction is, if whales descended from terrestrial mammals, we would expect fossils of species with transitional morphologies between these two taxa. The fossil species that LSS showed, as well as many others, all exhibit primitive mammal traits that modern whales don't have, and derived whale traits that no other mammals have in various degrees, which confirms this prediction. This is what scientists are actually trying to show with these fossils. They aren't trying to prove ancestral relationships, at least not between the transitional fossils themselves. They are showing that the fossils of extinct relatives with the expected transitional morphologies, as was predicted from the hypothesis that whales evolved from terrestrial mammals, have indeed been found. This is how we can say that there are tons of intermediate fossils and are completely correct, while critics who don't understand the point of this prediction are utterly wrong.
Is there even enough time for the transition from land to water to hypothetically take place? Again, taking the standard evolutionary numbers for granted, we've got about 8 to 10 million years to go from the land mammal Pakicetus to fully aquatic whales.
But that's a humpback whale, a baleen whale. Baleen whales first appeared about 20 million years after Pakicetus, and the first species of the humpback's family, Balaenopteridae, appeared after an additional 10 million years. I understand he was referring to the first fully aquatic whales, such as Basilosaurus, but they aren't similar enough to modern whales like the humpback whale for them to be interchangeable like this.
But more recently, scientists at Cornell University calculated how long it would take for different organisms to evolve two simple, beneficial mutations. For fruit flies with their relatively large population sizes and speedy generation times, it'd only take a few million years for two mutations to become fixed. For larger mammals like humans, who have much smaller population sizes and longer generation times, they calculated it would take over 200 million years. Again, that's only for two beneficial mutations. Okay, so where would whales and their supposed ancestors fall on that timescale? They're not as quick to reproduce as flies, but quicker than humans. So for two simple, beneficial mutations, that's supposed to take roughly 43.3 million years. So the evidence shows, using their own assumptions and calculations, that they don't even have 1/4 of the time needed for even two simple mutations. And it takes quite a lot of changes to go from the land to the water, it turns out.
So, LSS says that it takes a few million years for two beneficial mutations to evolve in a population of fruit flies, and more than 200 million years for humans. However, if you read the paper, these are actually not the expected waiting times for two beneficial mutations. It's about two particular pre-specified mutations to happen at specific locations in the genome. There is a huge difference between the odds of two mutations happening and the odds for two particular mutations at specific locations in the genome happening. It's rather like the difference between the odds of someone winning the lottery and the odds of a specific person, chosen before the numbers are revealed, winning the lottery. In the previous situation, there are lots of different people playing the lottery, which is why someone usually wins. Likewise, fruit flies and humans have lots of different locations in the genomes where beneficial mutations could take place, not just at two specific locations, which increases the odds substantially and shortens the waiting time as a result. The fact that the paper is about the odds of two pre-specified mutations rather than the odds of two mutations in general occurring and fixing in a population is bad enough, considering that LSS implied it was about the latter. But it gets worse. The number LSS references, several million years for fruit flies and over 200 million years for humans, aren't even about two beneficial mutations. The fruit fly number comes from the calculated time when they assumed these two pre-specified mutations to be neutral. When they modeled one mutation as neutral and the other as slightly beneficial, selection accelerates fixation, and the waiting time is reduced by a factor of 22 to 400,000 years. If the mutation is highly advantageous, the waiting time is reduced by a factor of 2,200 to approximately 4,300 years. The figure of over 200 million years for humans is based on one neutral mutation and one strongly beneficial mutation, not two beneficial mutations. Remember, this is still all about two pre-specified beneficial mutations, not any two beneficial mutations. The waiting times for any two beneficial mutations are vastly lower. Let this be another lesson for all the kids still in school. If you reference a paper to support a statement in your report, please read beyond the abstract.
To put that in context, take giraffes and their derpy little short-necked pals, the okapi. They're quite similar, and a recent paper studied their differences and found surprisingly 70 different genes that likely contributed to the giraffe's appearance. If animals that similar required 70 gene changes for basically just a longer neck and stronger heart, it's a pretty safe bet that animals as different as Pakicetus and whales would require at least as many, and more likely many thousands more.
70 gene changes for basically just a longer neck and a stronger heart, says LSS. But what does the paper say? Only half of the genes were involved in development, blood pressure, and circulation. The others were involved in metabolism, immunity, and DNA repair. LSS should read the papers he cites more carefully. This is a trivial point in his video, just intended to illustrate the obvious point that many more than two mutations are required to evolve from a terrestrial artiodactyl to a fully aquatic whale, but he still can't manage to get it right.
But it gets worse. Recently, a new Basilosaurus fossil was found in Antarctica that, even using the most generous dates for Darwinists, cuts down the time available for the whale transition to about half of the already not enough time of 8 million years, and could even place fully aquatic whales before Rhodocetus, before Ambulocetus, and contemporary with, or even before Pakicetus, destroying the entire fossil timeline.
Here, LSS uses a date of 49 million years old for the Basilosaurus fossil in Antarctica, which he calls the most generous date for Darwinists. As he says, this cuts the amount of time from the most basal terrestrial stem cetacean to fully aquatic forms to about 4 million years. In fairness to LSS, this is exactly how the find was originally widely reported in the popular press in 2011, so presumably was the best information available at the time. Since then, however, more detailed analyses of the strata that the fossil came from suggest that it is between 40 and 46 million years old, rather than 49 million years old. If these dates are correct, then the timeline for whale evolution isn't really altered at all, because Basilosaurus fossils were already known to exist as early as 41 million years ago. The paper describing these dates came out in March 2016, so even if LSS disagrees with them, he's not at all accurate when he says in April 2020 that 49 million years is the most generous date for Darwinists. The most generous date is actually 40 million years, which makes a big difference. And that's it for this video. From this point on, LSS doesn't make any new arguments. He just summarizes everything he said, saying that all of these things he pointed out makes whale evolution in the fossil record less impressive and that the scientists just believe evolution is true regardless of any problems. But the so-called problems that LSS points to aren't problems at all. Well, they aren't problems for evolution, at least. The problem lies with LSS's misunderstanding of the very subject of transitional fossils and what the theory of evolution actually expects to observe in the fossil record. Yes, he even has a problem with properly understanding his own citations. Again. In conclusion, LSS has completely fumbled his attempt to refute the fossil evidence of whale evolution. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.